Hello, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to Asia Arts Archive, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Özge Ersoy. I'm part of the curatorial team at AAA. And on behalf of the team, I want to say that we are extremely excited for our new exhibition, Countering Time, here at AAA's library. First, I wanted to say a couple of words about the background of this exhibition. And then I'm very much looking forward to being conversations with our wonderful speakers today. So starting last year, we committed to developing a more ambitious exhibition program for Asia Art Archives Library. And we wanted to have two exhibitions each year. And we wanted to have them highlight what we are really passionate about at AAA. The first one is archival research that we do, and the second one is our collaboration with artists like yourselves. So if you had a chance to see our previous exhibition, Another Day in Hong Kong, this was a project where we wanted to think about Hong Kong's art history through the lens of an ordinary day, as one day, a simple day. And that exhibition really emphasized archival research as a key methodology of the project. So our exhibition, Countering Time, has been building on these conversations that we've been having within the team, with our users, with our friends and colleagues. And we've been thinking about how we can speak about the units of time, our experience of time, and how we document time. And to start with, earlier this year, we invited four artisan writers, Weng Choy, Merve Ünsal, Simon Leung, and Gala Porras-Kim, to join us, to think with us, and to be in conversation with each other about this concept of archival time. And in the beginning, I remember that we talked a lot about this tension. On the one hand, we constantly try to quantify time. We try to think about units, but we also know that time, as we experience it, it defies a precise measurement. So this is how we've been basically speaking about. We've been exploring ideas and artworks and texts. And what I would like to do just to start the conversation is actually to invite you to think about this tension from two perspectives. The first one is our daily lives. You know, how our daily lives are structured around very specific units of time. You know, the way that we met at 7 p.m. today. So it's really about days, weeks, or hours and minutes. But especially if we think about our memory, things linger. You know, certain moments they would stretch, and then they would stretch indefinitely, and some of them would be much more fleeting. So that was the first thing that we talked about within us, and the second one was, of course, relating to archives and relating to history in general. And as an art archive, I can say that we have this penchant for quantifying time because we have to annotate archival works. We have to look at past events. We have to think about their dates and their contexts. But we also know that even if we do rely on these chronologies or timelines, there are no definite beginnings or there are no definite endings. And it's a continuous evolvement of many events that are on top of each other in history. So this is where we started. And today what we will do, we will discuss the process, especially this conversational model that I mentioned. We'll talk about the artworks and some of the inspirations that we've been exchanging within our group as well. So I would like to briefly introduce our speakers, and you can refer to the exhibition leaflet for their longer bios as well. So to my right, we have Gala Porras-Kim. Gala is an artist who's based in Los Angeles and London, and Gala closely worked with collecting institutions in particular, and raising these critical questions around conservation, preservation, and also how institutions like Asia Art Archive, I would say, how we shape an understanding of a history. Next, we have Simon Leung. Simon is an artist based in Los Angeles and Brooklyn. And Simon has this long-standing interest in thinking about different fragments of history relating to his hometown, which is Hong Kong. And we'll speak more about that. To Simon's right, we have Merve Ünsal, an artist based in Istanbul and Santa Cruz. What's really interesting about Merve's practice is that she has this obsession about tracing what is very difficult to represent or what is very difficult to measure with regular units of time. And last but not least, we have Weng Choy, who's an art critic based in Kuala Lumpur. And Wang has a deep-rooted interest in writing about artists who are obsessed about time. And also, I would say, Wang, your interest in friendships as a marker of time as part of your larger interest and larger framework that you're interested in. So before we start the conversation, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our amazing patrons who very generously supported this project. So a very heartfelt thank you to Mimi Brown and Arp Alçil, Uni and Ron Lee, Tracy Lee, Virginia and Wellington Yi. And I also want to acknowledge and thank our team, Rebecca Cho, Ruby Weatherall, Lily Wong, who are the co-curators of the exhibition, and they are in the back. And also Amber, our curatorial intern, who's also helping us just right outside the door, I think. So before, maybe I'm thinking where to start. It's been a long process, but maybe Gala, let's start with you. What I really appreciate about what you contributed, how you contributed to this project is that you created 3 works. 2 of them are in the reading room, in the space that we are sitting in right now. One of them is on the website. And for me, you're really asking questions about time of artworks. But maybe before that, can we speak about the time of art process, the working process, and what were the key moments for you? What are the key takeaways of this conversational model that we have developed over the past 6 months?
Thank you, Oski. I think that was it 6 months ago, 7 months ago, when you emailed us about this exhibition, the model was something that I had never really encountered, which was this process where we would meet probably every month, 2 weeks. I don't remember the
Every month.
every month.
Yeah.
And with a particular prompt, but not really that we followed it so directly. And so in a sense, it was a process where we kind of built the show in collaboration with each other. And so actually today is really strange because even as Wang was saying, when I came maybe 2 days ago,
Yeah.
that it was the first time we literally have shared physical space together, but we feel like really old friends.
Yeah.
So, like, I know you. And so the works also feel like they're sharing this temporality too. And so I thought that it was really, really in relationship to the archive, where we recorded all of those sessions, maybe for your own reference, but in a way it was like the works that might be in the space are just sort of the receipts of something that has already happened between us, which is the actual work. So that's kind of what I thought about the particular process of the show. And now you were asking me something else that I.
Would you like to say
Oh,
more?
yes. So the actual work, the time. Yes. And so for what I was thinking about making for this exhibition, I normally work with collecting institutions and how objects work inside of museums and how they get cataloged or conserved, etc. But the archive feels like there's no actual artworks here. So what is it that could be made that would live particularly here, not as a gallery space, but as a building where memory is kept of artworks? And so I thought about making a work that had to do with how do we recognize works that are not around anymore, so has been completely destroyed or forgotten. And so by chance I had been talking to a lot of insurance brokers of institutions about total losses in museums and how what was interesting to me is that so much energy is placed in the production of artworks, but we don't know how works get deemed dead or lost. And so one of those ways is a total loss. And so then I thought, how would that exist if the work doesn't exist in the collection anymore? It won't be on view ever again. Then when the work is damaged, it goes to like the carcass of an X art goes into this other place that is not in the collection or in the public or in the trash. And so I was thinking that the archive itself would be a site where this ephemera like insurance forms or even stories or different ways of remembering works that are not around would exist. No, so the particular works are these three works. One is a total lost ghost, and so I thought that we tried to actually find an actual total loss, but I thought that maybe it would be an abstraction that takes the placeholder of any work that we are not aware of the shape anymore. And so it's actually interchangeable, and that the ghost itself is more like it's a collaborative work between this particular instance and another author that we might not know. And so then the second work was, how does that even exist within the cataloging system of the archive itself? Because you have an infrastructure of cataloging information. So how does that accommodate this loss? And so now we have in the website this section where it might be potentially populated in the future for losses, whether it's through insurance documents, which is what I'm interested in, but also through like maybe oral traditions or how people might remember a work that might not be there, etc. So it's open to, I think it will be interesting to know how the archive itself will accommodate all of these fields of information that might not be so straightforward as the rest of the information that is here. Because yes, that's pretty much it. And by total coincidence, you have this book in the middle pillar. So I thought that we would make a catalog of destroyed works wrap, because then it would reflect all of these existing documentations of works. And so it's kind of like the memory of a work or potential idea that is visible and also invisible. Yes.
For me, what's really interesting is how you think about the idea of the trace. So for instance, when we look at the form, the ghost form that you created, and you can see in the back in the exhibition, it's not the object itself, it's the mold of the object. It's what surrounded the object for some time, but the inside is empty. It's the void. So it's the loss that we are talking about. And that reminds me of the type of things that we also collect at Asia Arts Archive, because these are not necessarily artworks, but we document and we archive everything that surrounds the artwork itself. So it's also a form of trace in a way. But which also brings me to the catalog of destroyed artworks, the column work that Gala was talking about. It is a book that is not possible to open. But for me, what it reflects is not only what we have in the library or in the archive, but also all of us. So it brings me to that idea of history not being just a series of grand narratives, grand stories, but very personal touches, the personal reflections and personal interpretations as well. So it's something that I really appreciate about your work as well. I don't know. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that.
Yes, but one of the things about the abstract form was that we have throughout the process sort of said what shapes we think there are, because sometimes it becomes recognizable as it's rotating. But I like that there are so many different versions. Like when you look at a cloud and it's like, I think it looks like blank or whatever. Then I think that it's also it reflects more about what you want that artwork to do for you more than what it might have actually been. And so it's almost thinking the archive is also the same, where you think that it's really saying something about a past, but in a way it really reflects what we want those works to do for us now, no? Like how the collection is actually, it feels like it has no limit, but it really reflects the particular views of the collecting body, you know? Yes.
Thank you. Wang, I'd like to continue with you.
Okay.
And I'd like to go back to our working process, because the contribution that you made for this project is the series of texts titled Prompts and Annotations. You can see them as posters, 4 pieces of posters in the exhibition space throughout the library, and also they are printed bilingually in this publication that Wang is holding. I'd like to continue with you because the way that you contributed, it immediately reflects the way that we work together. You always start a prompt by one of the artists in the group, and you are writing annotations, and you are saying that the annotations are they constitute a form to mark time. So I'm wondering if you can speak more about that.
Well, hello. So, Ozge, you, in your introduction, you used the word annotation, and that is something also that came up in our Zoom calls. How, a lot of art practices reflecting on time are like annotations on time. So that was something that came up to me about, okay, if I'm going to write something, they would be annotations. And then the idea of a prompt, getting a prompt from my collaborators and then responding to them with annotations. I was a little hesitant about the word prompt because it wasn't such a very deliberated choice as annotations were, but in the end I kind of liked it because prompts also had this signification of being on time, so the timeliness of things. One thing I did not think about was, when we're thinking about artificial intelligence and you're prompting there. So I have to write some more prompts and annotations, and that might come up, in that later half of writing. Now, when you walk into the space, what I think is really interesting is that the architecture of the space dictated the possibilities of display. So for instance, this structural pillar there. So what's also really nice about Gala's book is that it also is part of the deep structure of the building, right? So, the archive, is held up by a catalog of destroyed artworks. There's a little bit of that metaphor. That window there was just the choice window for Merve's image, these for Simon, and so forth. So the posters sort of follow the artist's work because the conversational aspect of things was so important. So it really, I think when we were deliberating, in the end, it became very clear to me that yes, the posters should be next to the artworks. And Simon earlier was talking about this idea of not, it's so important to speak next to things, the relationship of being next to something. There's something very interesting there because sometimes when you're next to something, it's not like you're, speaking directly to it, but the conversations run in parallel and they sometimes weave overlap, and sometimes they go their separate ways. So that interdependent relationship was very important. Now, on the other hand, I wrote them in an order. So you get that sense in the booklet. If you read them in order. And in order, the process unfolds a little bit more deliberately. So the first prompt that I wrote was, or the first prompt in the order is for Gala. From Gala. And I had this sort of format. I thought there would be a title, there would be the prompt itself, and then my annotations. But Gala just says, "Impermanence, please." And no other further explanation. So it sort of disrupted my format. And I thought, oh, that's the best place to start by, stumbling, right? So then, I write that. And then with other people, I sort of, quote some of the things that they've written or said. So our conversations from Zoom are sort of recorded slightly in that. And there's always these references to us talking over Zoom and everything. So it's very much also a marker of our process to do that. But that you get a better sense of that reading it in the booklet. But, you then also have that sense of how the work and the prompts and annotations sort of speak to each other physically. So there's those multiple dimensions, which I'm only beginning to really appreciate here, right? So like, oh yeah, we talked about it a lot and we planned, but what's really nice about coming together here is really feeling the sense of presence. So everything was planned conceptually, but it's also really nice, to come together. So that's also a really important part of the process. I think this realization through, the you said something about the coeval, how the different times are sort of coming together. So I really feel that experience, Gala, of our times, becoming very coeval by being, participating in the final installation and the event of the exhibition. Yeah.
And Wang, can you also say a couple of words about how your interest in writing about time or artists who are using time as a medium, how did it start? And how do you think about this project in relation to your previous writing?
Yeah, I'm trying to, Simon earlier talked about, the fictions of origins, right? So I don't remember, which is of course perfect, right? I don't remember when I started becoming very interested in time. But in some ways, an interest in time often comes in an interest in time travel. So, there's science fiction and all those kinds of preoccupations. I feel coincidence has been very important, and I've become quite interested in that. And I feel my own background has been in like philosophy and literature. So I'm not an art historian. So, when I think of my interests in art, like if you're going on a walk in the woods, right? Walking is also very important to me because walking, sometimes you're walking without necessarily a plan. You just like go with the flow, right? And I also am not that systematic. But let's say I bump into a tree and I really like this tree. I want to come back to it. So, I'm not always interested in covering vast amounts of territory or surveying or being very systematic and saying, oh, yes, I know every tree. I have a theory of trees and everything. No, it's kind of like, okay, here's a nice tree. Oh, you're so nice. Yes, I'll come back to you. And then you go on, oh, there's a really nice tree, but I'll have, so you're bouncing back and forth between the trees you really like. And so this is also this kind of constant cycling in return. So it's also a really interesting way of mapping my relationships to writing about artists. I come back and I rewrite, I write again about artists. I like to look at my old writing because it's also a way of going back to an old conversation that I had with the artist, even if the conversation is just in my head, talking to myself with an artist. So, it's this sense of reviewing. So there's the sense of the linearity, the way time unfolds when you look back. And hopefully you look back not with absolute disgust, oh God, I wrote that, or not with absolute smugness, like, oh, I'm so clever, So, there's that really nice dialectical relationship. So there's that linearity, but there's also the cyclical, because you're always constantly sort of going back and layering and everything. So, that's been that kind of process about writing about artists and thinking about how time, most of the people I write about, I would consider friends, even if they're dead and I never met them, So, that kind of relationship as well. So the conversational becomes very, very important in that way.
I'm thinking about one of those trees or one of the artists that you always come back to, who's Tae-Shin Shea. And we talked about Tae-Shin Shea's work in our conversations several times. And I remember especially the time clock piece from 1980. And Wang, I know that you recently returned back to Tae-Shin Shea's work. You wrote another book last year. And here I would like to turn to you, Simon, because I remember that you said when you teach, one of the most interesting questions for you in your class, you ask a very particular question about this work, which is, what is the time of the work? So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that question, where it comes from, and also how you think about these different time registers and how artworks have these different time registers within themselves. Maybe we can start.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Oscar and Rebecca and Ruby and Lily and Weng Choy and Merve and Gala, because it's been a purely enjoyable, thought-provoking, special experience. Okay, so yes, I'm sure that many of you know the work by Tei-Shing Hsieh, where he is standing next to a time clock and it keeps rolling. And the idea is that he takes a photograph of himself, one frame every hour on the hour for 1 year, right? So theoretically, he never got more than an hour's sleep during that entire year. And the document of it is less than 10 minutes, maybe six minutes or so, right? And I show it to my students and I ask them the question, what is the time of this work of art? And of course, there's no real answer. There's no correct answer to the work of art. But what one begins to think about is the time of the work of art the year? Is it the 6 minutes that you are looking at the film? Is it 1980? So in a way, the proposition that I try to get undergraduates especially to think about is that there's always a multitude of registers, that every work of art exists on a multitude of timescales. So this is also another way of saying that the work of art is always in some ways beside itself. Just as the speaker, I, in this instance with the mic, I'm very aware that here we are in a room and we're talking about artworks that are in proximate space, and many of you have not actually seen the work. So in some ways, we are in a way performing a type of archival function in relationship to the work of art. And therefore, earlier when Weng Choy was talking about how we discussed the notion of speaking nearby, well, one of the things that I would like to think about in an archive is how the artist is thought of as the unit of measurement in an archive, especially in modern contemporary art, right? But at the same time, the archive is in a way full of potential of speaking about these quote unquote people, but the people who are artists are only meaningful in relationship to one another, right? So in a sense, the measurement is only in relationship to the proximate others. And one of the things that I think is important in locating this proximity is to think about the ethical dimension of how whoever is speaking, whatever is being written, whatever is next to the thing or another thing comes from somewhere. There's, in a sense, a type of performativity, enactment, embodiment of a subject position.
And for me, it relates back to the way that you think about your practice. For me, one of the most striking things is that you really sit with, or you really spend a lot of time, sometimes more than decades, on certain images, on certain fragments, and you you keep them open, you keep them unstable when it comes to their readings, their interpretations, by bringing iconic works from art history, from film history, by bringing together different moments in history, and especially in relation to Hong Kong and your work in the exhibition. The starting point, if I can share with the audience members here, the starting point is a found photograph that Simon basically encountered in a newspaper. And you've been working on this particular photo for 15 years now. So I'm also wondering how you can speak about the ways in which you are opening up the interpretations of this particular photo.
Yeah, it's slight correction. I encountered it in a book. Yeah, but still. So it's a photo from 1967, and the face of it is actually you can enter into the Hong Kong room and you would see it, but I also replicate it. Yeah, it's a photograph of an arrest of leftists in 1967. And, you know, Oscar is right that I think about things for a very long time. I just wrote an opera and finished it and made it into a film this year. It's the second opera that I've made, but it took 22 years. And the first, I mean, I thought about it for 22 years and then I finally made it. And the first squatting project that I did, I believe, was 1994. Okay, thank you. The archival function. Yes. You know, often I have to Google myself to you know what what I said. But that actually came from an encounter. It came from my younger brother telling me that we were living in San Jose at the time, and it was I don't know, early 80s, late 70s or something like that. It must have been early 80s. And he said to me, oh, I saw some people at the bus stop and, you know, they're Vietnamese. And I asked him, how did you know that they were Vietnamese? And he said they were squatting. There were chairs at the bus stop, but they were squatting. And that became an extremely difficult but poignant moment for me, because here was a child, probably early teens, maybe a preteen, actively disassociating himself with other bodies which are also Asian, which to others in the US probably resembled him. So it made me think about how, in a way, the process of assimilation is one in which one evacuates certain cultural aspects, certain connotations, so that one's body becomes signifiable as an appropriate body. And I'm in a way thinking about this 1967 photograph in terms of what it could possibly mean. You know, what does the left mean in 1967? What does the left mean in 2010? What is the police in 1967? What is the police in 2010? Et cetera, et cetera. So when I first made the work, it was under the auspices of 1A Space, and it was a work without a form. In other words, I was interested in the recirculation of this particular image without it being anything in particular. So it existed as a mural at a sort of photographic mural at 1A Space that was produced so that the figures, especially the figures in the front, would be life-size, but it also was a workshop, a squatting workshop, where people physically squatted, lecture, of film, etc. So I was very interested in the idea of the work of art without a particular form. And of course, as one knows, what ensued in the last decade, in a sense, demands one to think about what was provoked in 2010 in a variety of ways. And I suppose I'm returning it, to its formlessness. Maybe I should say something about this. Okay. So I was working in Beijing for the month of August in 2019, and I happened to be in Hong Kong in September of 2019, and one knows what happened in September of 2019. And after one of the more eventful weekends, I was walking along next to a metro station, a subway station, and I saw that it had been cleaned up and the glass had been replaced and it was functioning again, but I saw a small piece of glass in the crevice of the ironwork there. And so I picked up this piece of glass and I just thought about it 4 or 5 years. No, actually, I thought about it for 3 years as a particular object, and in a performance for a Zoom lecture at Cooper Union, I used it to periodically cover the camera. And last year when I was here, I visited the site of where the photograph took place in Samsoibo, and 1967 photograph. And so I began to think about this little broken piece of glass as a lens from 2019 that one can use to look at 1967. And maybe I should stop there.
Sure. Let's definitely come back to these different fragments, because we're speaking about the glass, we're speaking about these cultural references that you're also using, especially in the video work. So we would love to speak more about the specific fragments and how they come together and how they keep each other unstable as well. But I would actually like to go back to that idea of the artist as a unit of time. And Merve, I want to ask you this question for 2 reasons. The first one is, how do you think about that particular phrase in relation to our group discussions? Mm-hmm. And the second one is, how do you think about that phrase in relation to the sinkhole, this very large-scale, centuries-old sinkhole that is the starting point for your work?
First of all, I would like to acknowledge that I feel like certain works can only happen in collaboration and friendship. And for me, this exhibition and this whole process has definitely been one of that, because I feel like there's certain things that, in dialogue, you can actually develop in a way that you would not otherwise be able to develop, maybe. Michael? Okay, closer. Okay. Thank you. So in terms of the artist as a unit of time, one of the things I have been thinking about a lot in relation to the sinkhole, which is also what I think one of our first meetings, the sinkhole was the image and the thing I brought to our collaborative meetings, because it was in a way my friend. I don't know what that says about me, but like basically thinking about the sinkhole and wondering how to relate to the sinkhole as an image maker, as a thinker, like how do I actually make work in relation to the sinkhole. And in terms of the artist as a unit of time, I think my relationship with the sinkhole, and also in terms of like making work in the cultural context of Turkey or outside of Turkey, in a way you're keeping history and you're kind of thinking about history or through history, speaking nearby history in relation to history, but in a way your works have an agency maybe that both goes beyond you and below you and around you at the same time. So how do we negotiate the temporality of the artwork in relation to the artist? So I would say agency in relation to artists as a unit of time is something that I think about a lot. And in that sense, to me, the work or thinking through the sinkhole has helped me negotiate that relationship and kind of like transcend this kind of like, can I be in a twerking relationship with the sinkhole's temporality, which is centuries old. But at the end of the day, it's something that we think about as a formation, but it's also defined by collapse. It's most of the time. And in Turkey, they've been like a lot of new sinkholes have been emerging in the last couple of years because of circumstances of drought and also human-made climate impact. And one of the things I think about, like, how do we think about it beyond collapse as maybe a living sedimentation, and how does sedimentation become living? And this, to me, is also how I relate to the questions of the archive, because in a way, archive can be considered a sedimentation, and how do we keep it a living sedimentation in a sense? And this is, I think, something that we have talked about in different ways.
I think about the different time registers that are related to the sinkhole itself. The first one is about the collapse itself, right? Because the collapse of the Earth's surface that defines what a sinkhole is, it's a sudden collapse. So it's very short in terms of the period of time, but it's basically, it results from these years-long or decades-long, maybe in this case, centuries-long changes that are happening underground. And it's mostly about the water and the rock formation in this particular area that's central Turkey, especially about the sinkhole. So, and then as you said, the lasting impact. But I remember also you saying that it's not, the collapse should not be the central theme when we think about it. And it's more about the human time versus the geological time, and then their collapse. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about this.
Also, one of the things I want to acknowledge in terms of the sinkhole is in Turkey in the last few years, there have been quite a few films made around the sinkhole as a kind of like representation or metaphor for the chasms in our population, like of basically a polarization. One person is on one end, the other person is on the other end. And I think in a way that's really becomes representational in a way that I wanted to also think beyond, just because there's something about if we think about ourselves as kind of relating to things in a way that is more than just image drivenness, if for lack of a better word. So if we can actually think about it from within. So I always imagine myself from like lying in the middle of the sinkhole and looking up and kind of like, what would that perspective change actually do? And what does that kind of making work do? And I think this is also something when we talked about the 1 year projects, for example, with Shay's work, and your question about what is the time of the artwork, I think definitely resonates, because in a way you're making work, you're thinking about time, but then you're also trying to reckon with the concept of time while you're thinking about that. So when you're making work in relation to an object of time, then it becomes about, so it has to be kind of somewhere between my body and that body, but also kind of more than the sum of our bodies, if that makes sense.
And I remember your frustration that basically kicked off this whole project around the sinkhole really started with you watching drone images of sinkholes. This was during the pandemic time, I think. Speaking about interesting obsessions, but you were telling us in the group as well that you were so upset that people were so confident to document and represent the sinkhole as one entity, as if it's so easy to mediate. So there was this interesting frustration then led to these speculative field recordings, as you call them. And I think it would be amazing if you can unpack that word, what you mean by speculative, and when the documentation becomes non-extractive.
Definitely. So I also try to think about the notion of event in relation to encounter, and how as artists sometimes we stage encounters, and I do work with performances in my practice as well. So I basically, the first encounter with the sinkhole was through a happening that I organized around it, when I read text to the sinkhole, and then afterwards I made a hole in the middle of my page and read the text again. So this kind of gesture of like, can I mimic the sinkhole in my language, and can I talk about the, and at that time, collapse was really important for me. So I also thought about these overnight events and nightmares and family events that we think about. And I think those things are shared on intergenerationally as well. So that was the first encounter. But that felt really lacking, because I felt like, who am I to say something? And, you know, what will my words mean to the sinkhole? So afterwards, I thought maybe one of the things I can do is I can actually think about my body in relation to the sinkhole, and actually treated as a field, but also it becomes a speculative field because everything I'm also saying about the sinkhole even now is very, very speculative. So in that sense, what you're seeing in this exhibition is I made a sound piece that is anchored in this 10.5 minute recording, which is the time it takes for me to walk around the sinkhole once. And then it basically negotiates the howling of the sinkhole and the bird sounds and the fly that accompanied me and all these things that happened around the sinkhole and turned it into a composition. And then I also made these graphic scores that kind of try to reflect that experience in a different way, which I hope becomes then something that other people can turn into their speculative field recording. So in that sense, the graphic scores are meant to be points of speculation for other people to hopefully interpret.
Thank you, Merve. And Simon, if we can go back to you, I'd like to sit with this idea of the artistic speculation and how, in your practice, how you think about that particular concept or artistic strategy to look at these different fragments of Hong Kong history that you were talking about.
Okay. Well, one thing that I think we already talked about with Merve, Gala's work and my work in like these photographs right here is that there's a degree of formlessness in all of our work in how they appear. At the same time, I've been very much obsessed with thinking about abstraction as a strategy and how abstraction is not enough and how abstraction is not enough in this. I mean, that's just a sort of stupid thing for me to say, but what I mean by that is that the relationship of abstraction to power is one that power can easily dominate and, in a sense, control abstraction when they see abstraction as a type of opposition, right? So I start thinking about the idea of fragment as being a sort of vibration of the abstract. The other thing that I began to think about was how allegory is also not enough, and how, in a way, one encounters how power also can read allegory. And therefore, the fragment becomes, in some ways, a sort of density of possibilities that relies on the multitude of reading that is always already available. So, for example, I made a video that is called "Who's Not Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue?" And I'm sure many in this room will remember that "Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue" is the title of some works by Barnett Newman during, I believe, the 50s. And that is in some ways how I want to think about, maybe the 60s, I can't completely remember. That is how I want to think about the possibility of something like the color red, the color yellow, and the color blue functioning simultaneously as an art historical referent and as natural, quote unquote, primary colors, and also in relationship to the specific relations we might have to these colors in our lives. So that's how I am thinking about the fragment.
Wang, may I invite you to say more about the speculation from your side, speculation as a writer, and how you think about your relationship to the archive itself? If you ask me, we need the speculation because, if I may just say a couple of words, I think one of the reasons why we've been very excited for this show is to also keep positioning ourselves as storytellers, right? Not only the people who would come and then who would write these grand histories, but creating the space for artistic speculation so that we can have self-reflection, so that we can think about personal interpretations. So to me, I'm convinced that we need you, but I'm wondering, especially as someone who's coming from writing background, you also mentioned science fiction. How do you see the role of speculation?
I want to talk about two things that are almost, I don't know if they're opposed, but they have that kind of tension. So to get back to walking, walking among the trees again. So maybe we have a dog. I don't know. So anyhow, we're walking on the one hand, but then also there's Instagram on the other, right? And what's so interesting about Instagram is, of course, it depends on the size of your device, right? I have a very small phone, right? So Instagram is very small for me, but everything is rendered in the same scale, right? There's that kind of real scalelessness of that. But, you're walking and your body becomes such a, you really feel your body because you're always seeing, oh, this tree, my body, and, oh, maybe the dog, So there's this continual sort of feeling of how you fit in, right? Now, the reason why I bring up Instagram is because, it conjures so many things about our information age. And, I started following Noah Harari, right? And he's, on this whole thing about junk information and how we have to really rethink, we're in the information age and there was so much optimism that we were receiving so much information, we have so much access, and yet so much of the consumption is junk information. And, likewise, there's the metaphor with junk food, so we have to be more mindful about how we consume information. But there was one thing that he was trying to talk about, that reality is very complex. And he was a little bit, at least on Instagram, right, making the opposition between reality and fiction. And so, I'm always on the side of fiction because of the way that some fictions can be very partial in their scale. They're very mindful of their scale. They don't, they reach, but they know that their grasp is very limited, which is different from some fictions that are mythic, right? And again, mythic, there's so many dimensions of it. They're the grand narratives of nation, all these kinds of appeals to, certain kind, like, oh, immigrants don't belong because, we are these kinds of people, these origin myths, right? But there are other forms of stories that are always very small, and they're not necessarily personal, but they're of that scale. And those are when I think of speculations, I also think of scales. So, to get back to the walk in the woods, it's your pace, you're walking. I'm not even running in the woods, right? I'm walking. So, it's kind of slow and leisurely. You can only cover so much ground. And it's limited to that. It's very human scale. So, that's the thing that when I think of speculations, they're very anchored, in that scale. And before I would be thinking about the body, how important the body is. And it's interesting that I translated that to talk more about scale than the body itself, even though they, are, they refer to each other continually. I wanted to point out, I don't know if you can see from there, but can you see that little, right behind Simon's head? Yeah, there, that's her. So, I think it's really important to locate the body in the picture, right? It's not a game of where's Merve, but, it's, really thinking about scale. So the speculative to me, at least the way I can respond to your question, because, I was trying to think, okay, how am I going to answer you? But it is to think about scale. And I mentioned that a little bit in some of the annotations that I have to talk about scale. And scale is something that, of course, we've discussed in many ways when we're thinking about time, in each of the practices, but also as the archive is always, thinking of that. So when we think of the speculative, what is the scale of speculation? Sometimes, people are very worried about that because the scale is actually quite large. But even then, what is a large scale? Like to talk about, a very distant future, but you can imagine a very distant future, again, in a very human scale or on a very kind of abstracted, Francis Ford Coppola has a new movie, which, Megalopolis, and, I think there's some grand scale fantasizing there. So I'm quite curious about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Wang. And Gala, I think I'd like to ask a similar question to you, and bringing together these ideas of both speculations and scale. I was thinking about how you work with collecting institutions, with enormous collections, but the way that you articulate these issues around conservation and preservation, you always find a very particular item, very particular idea from the collection, and then you open it up. And it's a lot of speculation that you also inject into these conversations with the institution. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that.
Yes, I think that for me is mostly to highlight how the idea of an artwork is not made by a singular author, but by many interventions of different perspectives trying to record what that original idea was. And so if we see the kind of order of how this idea came to be, then the artist is like, I need to kind of put this into a physical shape, and then it goes into an exhibition, and then it goes into a curated like text around it, and then it goes into an institutional, the public perception, and then it goes into the catalog, and then it goes into the publisher and the designer and then the conservator and then the registrar. And there's so many people in the life of an object that depending on when the audience encounters that idea, there will be so many variables that might exist. So for example, when I think about on the first time I learned of a work here through looking at one of these books, it has already been mediated by like 30 people minimum. And so I can't actually know what that original might have been. And so in a sense, is thinking about, when a book gets made, what year was the author at? Because it could be like early book, later book, after death book. Is it an art historian book? Is it an artist book? Very different, because some, when you see once you finish a work, it already goes into like past tense to some degree. And so it already begins to be like fresh art history in a way that it doesn't really belong to a singular author anymore. And so in a sense, the time immediately destabilizes from the moment of production into the moment of reception is always moving, because I want to think about a particular example with one of my works that I had talked to a curator as I was working on it. The work wasn't done, kind of like how we were discussing many of these works were not finished. And then once the work was finished, it was born, and there's an official beginning date, when it's not true that that work existed at the time. It came way before. And one of the drafts versions ended up being in the press. And so it actually now, when I read about this work, exists in a pre-moment that is not actually the work anymore. And so, which I kind of like, and also it's uncomfortable because I was like, that's the B-side, or like that's the sketch that now has become main character. And then as the time goes forward and forward, then many of the questions becomes really clear with all of the collections that you mentioned, because you can really see not necessarily that what the institution, they want to say that it's based on a historical past, like, oh, we're presenting like this is how ancient civilizations were, etc. but in reality, it actually says more about what that person wanted that work to be. So for example, if you see like works being conserved in the 70s versus the 80s, is totally different types of interventions, even though the original object might have been made exactly the same. And so to recognize those interventions actually becomes more interesting because we learn about what we want those objects to do today. And so the kind of the interest for me is to you know, separate like a singular version of understanding that history into like you know, not that we can ever really know what happened back in the day, because until we can time travel, none of us were there. To to see how that original moment and the current moment of viewing is always moving, and that makes the same object mean totally different things throughout time.
I mean, what I really appreciate about how you've been contributing to all of these conversations and also with your artworks is that we did start with this very large concept of archival time, but we've been really thinking about how we document and experience the afterlives of artworks, afterlives of past events, afterlives of geological formations, and afterlives of artistic collaborations as well. And I think these ideas that we talked about today, sedimentation, scale, speculation, preservation, these are the other directions that you have provided us to think about with this exhibition. So I'm very, very grateful to all of you. I'm aware of time, and I really would like to have ample time for some comments and questions from our audience members. So I would like to open up the floor to any reflections that you might have, any questions that you might have. And my colleague Lily will hold the microphone for you.
Sorry.
Just a quick one, and I'm bouncing off what Wen said, how he found in scale was his anchor for his practice. And I want to throw that question out to the other artists. Given you're working with things that are constantly abstract, formless, what anchors you? Where's your stillness?
Is this on? Okay. Cushion.
It's
I'm the assistant.
it's a bit also like the origin question that we've been thinking about with the fictional origin story, what anchors me. One of the things I try to think about in relation is, I think, the concept of agency, which I will come back to, because I think that I'm trying to think about how my agency as a human being and as an artist in a way affects all the other agencies, and in that sense I think in the context of this work and also in the context of our collaboration and friendship in this situation, in a way what anchors me is that my time is going to be different from the other time, and then how do I actually articulate that time so that it can become times that then becomes the times of the works that we are collaborating on. So in short, I think the expanding on the notion of agency in that sense, I think, is in a way my anchor.
It depends what type of anchor, because I think that the challenge is to become unanchored from the things that you think you know already. And so I feel like majority of the processes of our thinking is to try and question, what do I actually think is an anchor and why did it become that way? You know, because I think that there are many things that at least I just take as a default that are kind of fake, not fake anchor, but individual anchor when there's multitude, and anchor and the singular version is kind of just out of to pacify some anxiety, because it's an infinite amounts of possibility, and then we need to like at least be like, well, the institutional anchor is a emotional insurance, or like the law is a political anchor that gives us insurance, but all of those things are abstract to begin with. And so how do we, at least for me, it's been to unanchor, to try and see other possibility at all. And so trying not to be anchored is the anchor, I guess.
Well, you know, anchoring is a nautical metaphor, and it is a nautical metaphor for the temporary occupation or the temporary aligning with land. And for, I don't know, 30 years or so, I've thought about the squatting body and how the squatting body is a place of rest. And one occupies this position always in a field of power, that one is always already a text, but at the same time, the association, at least in the English language, of squatting with the illegal occupation of real estate is very much related to, in my mind at least, an ethos of aligning oneself with others and how that might signify in relationship to a background of property, but also nation. So one of the earliest works that I've made about the forcible repatriation of Vietnamese guest workers in Germany in the early 90s, because a new group of cheaper labor became available in the newly reunified state, meaning East Germans. How that might signify in the metropolitan West, and how that would signify very differently in a place like Hong Kong, in the sense that there is a form of racism against mainlanders who are seen to be squatters. But the other thing about, you know, the anchoring of oneself is that even though the squatter is at rest, the squatter is always already ready to work, ready to perform a task. And the thing about squatting is that you're squatting and then you're not.
Thank you. This is one for Merve. I was a bit early and I was looking at your landscape documents and the mapping or the collage things, and the sound was really amazing that you have accompanied it. I want you to comment on the sound marriage with this work.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And I'm glad the sound resonated with you. So the sound is actually a composition that's based on field recordings, which is why I'm considering them to be speculative field recordings, because we went to the site and actually spent 2 days taking recordings. So in a way, everything is based on those 2 days of actual field recording. The wind and my walking, and you also can hear the squeak of my shoe at one point. There's a fly that comes with me, and there's also I trip and I stumble. So there's a lot of so they're not really also clean field recordings in the more maybe let's say extractive sense of how field recordings are made to be clean sound. So they're very not clean field recordings, which became the basis of the composition. But then I really struggled with the composition because I was trying to negotiate these different emotional affects and registers pictures and what I was thinking about it as ideas, but also how I was feeling. So I then gave this composition to someone else with words attached to it, and then she finished the composition for me. And then after the composition, the collages changed. So in a way, I see the graphic scores that we have as also being in relation to the sound, but not the same thing as the sound. So it went back and forth in that sense. And then this image is kind of the background and the kind of the origin story of everything in that sense. So other things are compositions or responses to what happened at this site visit. Was I able to answer your question?
No, it was great. Now I want to see if I can find more about this work on the web. Have you got this documented on YouTube?
It's just here for the moment, but the previous version of the work, which was that staged encounter where I read the text, is also online, which you can see there. Yeah.
I have a question. So you've been talking a lot about, so it's been a 7-month collaborative process between all of you, and that it couldn't have come about without, this strong friendship and bond that you've built together by meeting every month. And I just wonder if there's maybe a particular moment or a conversation that you had with your fellow practitioner that you think will stick with you as you go forward in your continued practice. Like, what has this experience, what do you think that this will add to your practice as you go forward after this experience?
Well, I mean, in my case, right, this idea that, there were moments of prompts, and then but the idea also is that annotations don't stop. You keep on annotating. So, there's that sense. I like to, return. I still have some writing to do, unfortunately, because writing is hard. But so for me, there's that sense of continuation. So that's, I think, a response. What's very important is that continuation, that sense of continuation, and finding ways of trying to do that. Gala was sort of talking about, you work very, very closely with somebody, but then you move on to the next project. And it's so funny how you've had, that kind of experience, that kind of intimacy, and then you have to sort of leave it behind, right? And of course, that's going to happen, right? But how does that sense of trace continue, right? Whether or not it means that we're communicating, or whether or not it sort of, informs, because you're continuing to work with the sinkhole, you're going to squat some more, you're going to continue, to think about total loss. So each of us in our own ways have these kind of trajectories that we'll continue to pursue. So what's so interesting is how this kind of moment of intensification about those things will linger separately there. So I think, that'll happen. But there's also an interesting way of being very open to coincidences and future returns. So I'm not, the question is sort of thinking, is there a moment that you will take with you? And I've kind of thrown it on the head to say that I'm anticipating moments in the future, right? So, I've just done this kind of weird thing. I can't think of, any special moment, but I'm just always anticipating the next moment that way.
I'm also struggling with thinking about the specific moment, but one thing I think is when you work closely with artists and thinkers, you're in a way trying on their methods for size, and you're figuring out, okay, what would happen if I tried to do this in my work? Or there's something about that I think, because by comparison, immediately your mind begins to you start to think about other people's methods. So that's something I will take away, because I think I have become more familiar in a way with these different methods or thinking and sensibilities also, which I think artistic practice is always about developing a sensibility. So I think that's something I'll take with me. And also just in terms of Shay's work, I will go back to that one meeting was very important for me, because the way artists think about other artists' work, I think, is something that will stay with me. And that's, I think, something we should insist on. And that's an intervention that we need to make into the institutions. So that's definitely, I will keep thinking about that one meeting where we talked about that.
I go. I think today is a really weird day because it's the first time that these works that we've been making together become archival, number one, first day in the public. And so when I was thinking about this talk even, I was like, oh, it's going to be like our Zoom, but it's the opening Zoom. And so the idea of like not having a monthly conversation is really weird. And so I thought that in the future, because, you know, artistic production is so lonely, you're like in your head all the time. And I don't think I have talked to other artists in the production of making work since like grad school or something, when you're sharing physical studio space. And so I can anticipate that when I see your future works, I can be like fly in the studio of how that work got made, because I've already known part of your particular director's cut, not front of the house moments, you know what I mean? Which most audience doesn't actually get to see. And so I also think like what I think brings me closer to, and the process has been, is more like, you know, like the weird blobs in the studio, or like we have been in so many different time zones and being like in the car or whatever together. And so I think that it's this like strange director's cut that you have, that we have had, that is not like the way that I have experienced even previous works of yours that I have seen, that now I know like, oh, this is how probably that future work, how it they arrived at it at some point, like in a minimal sense or something like that.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm squatting on the inside, so I'm squatting now, even though I'm sitting. I want to de-idealize for a second, because I think, Gala, you put, you know, I think pinpoint the process, and that is, I don't think necessarily that I wouldn't have made this work without being in the company of these fine, brilliant people. However, I think it's extremely meaningful to make work in a vulnerable way, in the sense that we witnessed one another changing our minds, developing the work. I remember sending Oscar, you know, and this, I thought, what I thought was a brilliantly theorized method, and then changing my mind, you know, and witnessed by everybody else. And I don't know if I would have changed, I don't know if I would have changed my mind without the others, but I think there is something really important about having someone else witness you developing, changing. And, you know, that's another way of talking about being nearby. I just, of course, you know, I really want to emphasize that this term, speaking nearby, is really, it's really associated with my friend Trinity Minha, you know, who has theorized it in a post-colonial and feminist way, in an infinitely more, you know, beautiful and sophisticated way than we've talked about it. So I just want to make sure that we mention Minha.
So I have a question about the process of arriving at the exhibition title, Countering Time, because I'm still like puzzled by countering, and also its a relationship to its a Chinese translation, which I think is very different from the English exhibition title. So because you mentioned it's a very collaborative and conversational process, so can you talk more about how did you arrive at this exhibition title?
Maybe we can speak about the English title, and Lily or Rebecca, you can say more about the Chinese title as well. But one thing that I would like to share is that I think for us, it immediately communicated that tension that I was speaking about in the beginning. You know, that penchant for counting all the time, but also when we think about these artistic methodologies and sensibilities that we've been speaking about today, how you resist that, how you resist these strict chronologies. So I think in our way of thinking, this was one word that somehow performed that tension. Maybe this is where I can start. And if you'd like to have any additional comments. Merve, please.
Small comment, because I think it's also something this was a very, I think, hard exhibition to title, and I know the curatorial team definitely gave it a lot of thought, but for me, countering time also is something in relation to time, and I think in a way a lot of the works are figuring out their relationship to time. It doesn't define time, but it's like a action or actfulness or in relation to time, which I think is something that's like in the motion and in progress, which I think is an important part of the title. Is it's in a way hasn't finished yet, and it's not complete yet in that sense.
So maybe I can add a bit about how we think of the Chinese title. So working together as a team of, as a curator, between the 4 artists and also between the curatorial team, we actually came up with the English name first, and then we worked out a Chinese name for the exhibition. When we think about countering time, we had come up with various possibilities, and at the end we settled on Mo Si Mo Hat, which we think of it as more as a literal, a translation of the conceptual idea of the exhibition, which when we think about time, we think about how we try to seek for precision, but at the same time, there is often elusiveness that we encounter when grappling with time. So if you think about Mo Si Mo Hat, that could come, it would come with 2 meanings, which means any time, but at the same time, it could also mean there is no time and there are no measurements. So this is how we come up with this title, which we hope that could bring out the essence of the English exhibition name.
Hi. Sorry. Thank you very much for your sharing. I do have a question thinking about time and your process of discussion through Zoom, the time difference. So to what extent time difference, as you all look at one another, one is in daytime, one is in nighttime, to what extent, could that kind of time difference play a part to imaginations of speculation, disruption, and at the same time layering as well? Thank you.
I thought it was really nice to not have to anticipate when we would meet, because it was no set. For the most part, it was like accommodating a lot of things. So the novelty was to talk to the group at like 10 p.m. or something, when I have a particular studio rhythm which I follow, and then I delete and then try to fall asleep. But I think that the changing of the schedule really forced even a day-to-day different time frame, and the tons of text messages we had to send to match our continuously rotating things. So what I liked about the process was also the commitment to really accommodate all of these different times in the beginning. When Osuke presented the idea, I'm like, how is that even going to happen when 4 of us are continuously moving in different situations, but that we aligned every time was like, I don't even, like a logistical thing, but really helped to kind of separate the thought process from like the day-to-day production of my other works in the studio.
Yuan, I didn't realize this until you raised the question. During the 6 months, I didn't travel. I was always KL time. Osgate, were you other times? Did once? Yeah. So you guys, really varied in your time zones, right? But I was always the same time. And this is just, by certain kind of accidents. I had traveled a lot in the beginning of the year, but then I stayed put for a while. So this is, my first trip since, earlier in the year. But yeah, so that's kind of funny. So that experience of having to, make adjustments because I'm, like, oh, but yeah, sure. Sometimes I had to talk in the morning and sometimes I had to talk in the evening, right? But I always was in KL talking. Whereas, New York, Los Angeles, London, Turkey, all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of interesting. I'll have to write about it later.
We hit 5 a.m. for Merve.
Yes, you're the champion. Yeah. Yeah. No wait, and the car, right? Yeah. So yeah, so like
I want to. Okay. I just want to think about this question in relationship to the realities of people's lives. So, for example, if when one teaches, as I do, um, keeping time with the other or recording your lecture so that somebody who's in China can listen to your lecture. In other words, there's a strong ethical dimension to being on time with the other, right? And also, I am somebody who does not travel except for work or to visit my mother, but we're in the same time zone. So I really try to keep as minimal. I don't like to be on different time zones, unnecessarily. I never travel for pleasure, really. So I think that in some ways, we're in the contemporary art world where people are always bragging about, being in, 4 continents in a week or whatever. I just want to sort of think a little bit about the way in which we toss around time zones and this type of thing as if it were a commodity. And there are other ways to think about it.
So when we think of time, usually it's when we think of time, it seems to pass very quickly, and it's in the past, and we can see what has happened, what we've made, and what others have made. And I guess the closest we come to the present is now, but also it's already in the past. Have you considered of it in the future? I guess we today you considered of each other's art in the future and how you would you could then imagine how they might have made it in the future. But my question is, when you were making these pieces of artwork, did you find your own personal time going fast, going slow? Did it go fast after you had a chat, or did it go slow? Was there a lot of thinking? Because our perceptions of time, I know there's a measured time of 24 hours, etc., but our own perceptions of time are quite different sometimes. Some days go slow and some days go fast. So my question to you is, did your meeting each other on Zoom affect the duration of time, or the durée, as maybe Bergson might have put it?
I think in the production of the particular works I made, it took a really long time, probably even before I was born with my parents, and all of the like thinking about archives since forever to come to think about the theoretical structure of the work, but the formal part was very quick. So I think that even we were texting like 2 days ago or something, being like, what color is it? I don't know, you know. And so I think that the different aspects of the work had a particular time frame. So I don't actually know how the Zooms actually might have affected the way of production, because I can't tell if it's other parts of my life that actually determine what the speed or slow of the production was. But I think that, as I was saying this, it feels like the conversations were kind of for me, the one of the main characters of this particular exhibition, that we had made many of the, at least my kind of thought process together, not together, but like I made them informed with our conversations. And then today is like, it's hard to say that it had stopped or something. I'm like, already, I haven't felt, because we just started, I haven't felt the end of something. I'm thinking like we're going to Zoom in a month from now, because just muscle memory hasn't.
One thing you said, though, was about the installation, how it went very, very smoothly. So what's interesting is that, there's a lot of, like you say, like last minute decisions still, but they had a certain kind of momentum. So there were no sort of kind of crises. I mean, obviously, there might have been, big decisions and shifts and everything like that, but it's interesting because some processes will have this kind of moment of crisis and so forth. But there was that sense of, and I don't think it, I don't want to over-explain it. I'm just being descriptive rather than analytical. So the process happened to kind of culminate very smoothly.
And I also think that we had different timelines, because you had to have so much layup to get the book.
Yeah, because translation has to happen, and so I had to.
And I don't think you even knew what color this thing was going to be until you arrived and were like, "Oh, there were choices made."
Yeah. No, but yeah. So there's something like that. But also just speaking, how you were laying out some ideas about a process, and how. One of the things that I'd like, and it hasn't happened in this case, and I don't know what that means. Have I jinxed it or anything like that? But I remember once doing a writing workshop with a friend, and someone asked a question about planning and preparing an essay, and then my friend responded by sort of saying, "Okay, yeah, this is how I prepare," and he was very methodical about talking about that. But then I went and said, "Look, actually for me, what's really important in a writing process is being so obsessed and invested in something, and then realizing you have to let it go." So, there's a certain sense of the maturity of a process. So there's sometimes indicators of when you feel like, oh, the process has had its maturation and that. And for me, one of the indicators is sometimes you have to let something go. And sometimes it's not. There's a small reference in one of my annotations to an essay I was working on. And I was fortunate that it unfolded over time and had some visits. And one of the ways that was so important, the way I could finally finish the essay, is because I was visiting Hong Kong the last time I was here in 2019, and I ran into Simon, and we had this kind of conversation. He said something, and that really helped me. So, the way that accidents intrude and everything like that, but you can't plan that. So, in terms of an unfolding, yeah.
You want to go first? I don't know if the time of the other is something we ever understand. And I don't even think we know our own time. When I was thinking about this work, I was obsessed with the idea of making something with a mirror. And it didn't really come to the forefront of my consciousness until I was reminded that they're facing mirrors that is already in the architectural space. Because I was in Hong Kong for 3 weeks last year, courtesy of my university, you know. And so in some sense, perhaps in the recess of my unconscious, I was thinking about the infinite regress of this moralical facing. And in some ways, I think perhaps this is how one always exists in relationship to the time of the other, right? It's not so much that I think about Gala's ghost or I think about Merve's sinkhole and it's going to change, but I have no idea how it's going to reappear. You know, how I might sink into it, or I might be haunted by it, or I might, in a sense, quote without quoting, quoting without attribution, or, you know, be prompted by something that Weng Choy has written.
I was speaking to a friend earlier today, and they might be actually in the room right now. And it was their birthday on Sunday, and they said, I'm really thinking about rewording this idea of the birthday, and what if we call it the continuation day? And I think this is how we've been thinking about our exhibitions as well. I think this is only one of the continuation days. And I would like to share with everyone that this is going to continue for another 6 months, and we will invite more artists. Some of you will be coming back to do some programs. So for us, it's also an unfolding process that will continue and also change the way that we think. We think about the time in the archive, the way that we experienced it, documented, and how we speak about it. I think this is where we will wrap up. I would really like to thank all of you. So much gratitude to all of you. And thank you so much for joining us on a Friday evening as well.